Good afternoon and welcome to another in our series of Plato-Madison lectures. I'm Joy Cardine. I'm a member of the Plato-Madison Lectures Committee, where I have the honor of participating in these events. I'm also a retired Wisconsin Public Radio talk show host, so this allows me to continue in a certain way a service that I love to do. We have a very timely and very important lecture today, and one with a lot of interest. We are expecting a great turnout, and it will also be recorded and put on our website, platomadison.org, for the many others who wanted to be here today but cannot. Last month, the Wisconsin State Assembly passed a bill that would prohibit public schools from teaching students and training employees about systemic racism or concepts associated with critical race theory. This bill must still pass the state Senate before being sent to Governor Tony Evers, who is expected to veto it. The vote in the Assembly was along party lines, 60-38, with all Republicans in support of it and all Democrats opposed to it. Wisconsin is not alone. This is a national trend. According to the Associated Press, 8 Republican governors have signed bills or budgets into law that ban the teaching of critical race theory in K through 12 schools. Similar bills have been introduced or other steps have been taken in more than 20 additional states. So, what is critical race theory? And why is it controversial? That is the subject of today's lecture with UW-Madison Professor Emerita Gloria Ladson-Billings. Dr. Ladson-Billings is the former Kellner Family Distinguished Professor and Chair of Urban Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and faculty affiliate in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at UW-Madison. She is also the president of the National Academy of Education, where she was among the first to apply critical race theory in education. I will present your questions about critical race theory and what's happening today to our speaker after her talk. So please type those questions in the Q&A box. Dr. Ladson-Billings, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I guess I should get started. I'm a typical professor and tend to be long-winded, so I'm going to actually use some slides to keep me on track here. I'm not a lover of slides, but I do think they serve as guardrails for me so I don't ramble too much. I'm going to try to maybe spend about 30 minutes. I'm going to share my screen for the audience, and hopefully you are seeing a title screen that says, "Oh no, critical race theory." And yes, my subtitle is Undoing Misinformation and Distortions. Again, I'm going to try to do this efficiently. So let me just start with what I'm calling the rest of the world and how the rest of the world discovered critical race theory. This statement by then President Donald Trump on September 2020 says it is a, quote, toxic propaganda that will destroy our country. And his words really get taken up from the work of Christopher Ruffo, who is a Manhattan Institute fellow. 2 tweets that Ruffo offered, I think, kind of set the groundwork for why all of a sudden we are seeing all of this response to critical race theory. He said, the goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and we will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. And then secondly, he says, we have successfully frozen the brand critical race theory into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. So I want you to remember that this is as of last year. And so what he meant by that is that any discussions of race, racism, diversity, equity, inclusion, whiteness, and so forth are now under this brand, and they are rendered toxic. But for your information, the 1619 Project is not critical race theory, but it's been placed under this category. So I think it's important for you to understand how this debate was being shaped. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a history, at least a personal history, and that is where I learned of critical race theory. The first probably writing and reading that I did of critical race theory took place back in 1989 when Derek Bell published And We Are Not Saved. For those of you who don't know Bell, the late Derek Bell, he was the first Black tenured law professor at Harvard University. And he was, a very gentle man, but known for taking principled stance that didn't always benefit him. He actually did a hunger strike on behalf of legal scholar Dave Trubeck, who spent most of his career at University of Wisconsin Law School. Trubeck was at Harvard. He was not offered tenure. And Derek Bell went on a hunger strike. David Trubeck was not Black. He was a white professor, but Bell felt very strongly about the work he was doing. Bell also left Harvard because, according to him, Harvard had promised him when they hired him that they would hire a Black woman, and they didn't do it. And so after years of being at Harvard, Bell left, refused to come back, and became dean at the law school at Oregon. He had a position at Stanford that he did as a visiting scholar, came back to NYU, where he finished his career and died a few years ago. So that's my first encounter with that work. In 1991, I came to Wisconsin as an assistant professor, and one of the first books I read was by another professor at the law school, and that was Patricia Williams. It was a book called The Alchemy of Race and Rights, and Patricia Williams went on to become law professor at Columbia Law School. And then a third piece that I read while here was a piece that was actually written in 1988 by Kimberly Crenshaw called Race, Reform, and Retrenchment, that talks about the anti-discrimination law. Crenshaw was a Hasty Fellow here at Wisconsin. And for those of you who are unaware, much of the work of critical race theory started in the law school at Wisconsin. The very first workshop in the 80s, subsequent workshops, many of the fellows like Crenshaw, Patricia Williams, Linda Green, who spent most of her career here and is now the dean of the Michigan Law School, took that position this year, are all people who worked with Derek Bell and helped to refine the ideas around critical race theory. My first critical race theory article was published in 1995. So here we are in 2001. I tell people who have asked to interview me about this, that if it is a quote revolution, it's one of the slowest revolutions that I've been a part of. And I'm gonna be dead by the time it accomplishes anything at this rate. I also happened serendipitously to publish a book of my writing on critical race theory in education this year. In fact, just a month ago. Apparently, everybody now wants to read it. I always thought of it as sort of obscure work that only people interested in it was theorists. But it is now taken off because of Ruffo and many of the folks on the right's notion that it's toxic, it's dangerous, it's anti-American. So, what is critical race theory? Well, first and foremost, it's a legal theory. So why would we even have it in K-12 schools? I have no idea. I've not seen it in K-12 schools. I will tell you though, having taught in K-12 schools, I taught in the school district of Philadelphia for 10 years. I taught history. I can tell you that by making it forbidden, if you know anything about adolescent development, now they want to know about it. They didn't care about it before we ginned up all this controversy. But it's merely a legal theory, but it's been appropriated by other social sciences and education. So sociology has taken a look at it, anthropology, psychology, even the arts are beginning to look at it. And it's designed to explain racial inequality. It's what academics do. They try to explain things. So a question that I often ask people who ask me about critical race theory is, so how do you explain racial inequality? If you don't believe there's no inequality, then we actually can't have a discussion. But if you recognize that there is inequality, how do you explain it? Well, I will tell you that from 1619 to the mid-20th century, we actually accepted biogenetic explanations for difference. We said, oh, those people are just not as good as other people. They're not as smart. They're lazy. I mean, we've all heard the stories about the genetic inferiority of Black people. Indeed, that explanation, the biogenic explanation, was very popular. And in fact, there are colleges that have departments of eugenics. Now, when we got through that era, we claimed that the inequality existed because of unequal opportunity. And so we started to see some progress in the form of legislation like the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. We saw the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We saw affirmative action happen in 1965 and the Voters' Right Act of 1965. But guess what has happened? Each of these, quote, opportunities has been rolled back. Most Black and brown children still go to school with Black and brown kids. Segregation is alive and well in most urban districts. The Civil Rights Act has been rolled back. Affirmative action is in the courts constantly. And the Voters' Right Act, you are seeing what's happening to voting across the country, that states are limiting things like the amount of days, the access to voting, the whole brouhaha we had in the 2020 election over mail-in voting. So each time there is, quote, opportunity presented, it gets rolled back. So what critical race theory claims is that the problem of racial inequality is systemic. It also argues it to be sort of permanently woven into our laws and policies. So that's an explanation. And I tell people all the time, if you give me a better explanation for any racial inequality, I'm happy to look at it. But for right now, critical race theory tends to explain it for me. I want to start with a personal story. A few weeks ago, one of my former students who teaches social studies in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, asked his students to find out if anybody in their family benefited from the GI Bill. And if you know Chapel Hill, you know it's not unlike Madison or Urbana-Champaign or Ann Arbor. It is a college town. So most of the white students reported that their grandparents received funds for education or access to housing or small business loans via the GI Bill. But one of the students said his grandfather, who didn't have a high school education, actually started his broom business from a GI Bill sponsored small business loan. And he eventually became a millionaire. And he said, my whole family continues to live off of this money. But none of the Black students could find a relative who benefited from the GI Bill. Now you might argue, well, the GI Bill was for all GIs. Well, here's what we know, that Black GIs did not receive the bill's benefits because many Southern congressmen pushed to make the administration of the bill a state responsibility. It's sort of like what we deal with healthcare. Yes, there's a law saying that everybody is entitled to healthcare and they can't be denied, and this, but each state has administered this law differently. In some states, there's a Medicare expansion that includes more people. So around the GI Bill, most states had racial covenants restricting homes to whites only. And the Blacks who entered vocational and trade programs couldn't gain entrance into some of the fields that they were going to. So I might want to be a plumber or a carpenter, and I could use my GI Bill to be trained, but coming out of the school, I couldn't get a job because the trade was closed off to me. The industry was closed off. The GI Bill actually helped create wealth among white workers and contributed to the wealth gap that we now experience. So this isn't about an individual GI. This is about a system that operates to ensure that some people benefit and others do not. My own father was a World War II veteran. And like many of those veterans coming home, he wanted to purchase a home. So by 1950, he was ready to buy a house. Here I have it, I'm calling this a tale of two homes because on the left is a home in the West Philadelphia neighborhood in which I grew up. On the right are the homes that were going up right outside of Philadelphia in Levittown. In both communities, both homes sold for $8,000. Today, the home in West Philadelphia is assessed at $93,000. The Levitt homes are going for about $500,000. So here again is an example of the loss of wealth. Now, why did we end up in West Philly? Because the Levittown homes had a clause 25 in their lease that said the home could not be used or occupied by any person other than the members of the Caucasian race. This isn't about an individual GI not allowing my father to live a certain way. This is not about an individual GI being racist towards my father. This is an entire system operating that says, we don't care that you're a veteran. We don't care that you qualify for it to purchase an $8,000 house. You can't live here. So this is happening in Philadelphia. And of course, Levitt homes were being built outside of New York City, outside of Baltimore. But meanwhile, in a place like Chicago, people bought homes, but they didn't actually understand that they were buying what were called contract homes. And the contract buying worked like this. You had a buyer who put down a large down payment for a home. They made monthly installments at very high interest rates, but the buyer never gained ownership until the contract was paid in full and all of the conditions were met. Meanwhile, you have a contract seller who held the deed, who could evict the buyer. The contract buyers also accumulated no equity in their homes. and there were no laws or regulations to protect them. Here's what we know. Between 75 and 95% of the homes sold to Black families during the 50s and 60s were sold on contract. And the price markup on those homes sold on contract was 84%. What we saw were African Americans who bought on contract, on average, paid an additional $587 in current dollars, more a month than if they had a conventional mortgage. Again, this is not about individuals hanging nooses outside of someone's house or spraying KKK letters on their garage doors. This is about an entire system that is operating. And so this is the kind of thing that critical race theory examines. So what are the tenets of critical race theory? I take them from the work of Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic, that number one, racism is normal. It's not aberrant. It's not that, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. It's the expectation that these things will happen, that they are everyday experiences for people who are not seen as a part of the mainstream. A second tenet is something called interest convergence. And I'm going to try to quickly go through each of these. And if you want more explanation, we can certainly take those up in the Q&A. A third tenet is the notion of race as a social construction, that it's not a real thing. You know, all the biologists, the geneticists tell us it's not real. It's like the difference between calico cats and tabby cats. They're just cats. There is not this race versus that race, but we've constructed it, and we'll talk more about that. The notion of intersectionality and anti-essentialism is a part of this work, and that is that none of us is just one thing. Our identities are complex, and it's really difficult. Even though we've highlighted race in the theory, there are other issues that matter in people's identities, and that there is a place for folks' voice or their counter narratives. What's their other story? Now, one of the challenges that people have said is, well, you're just telling stories. Well, I don't know if you've ever been in a courtroom, but courtrooms are places where people tell stories. They can have the very same evidence, and the defense tells a different story than the prosecution. Hence why voice or counter narrative actually fits well into legal scholarship. So the notion that racism is normal. Well, if you go back to the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal, who did this book called The American Dilemma, he argued that the failure of American liberal democratic practices in America is kind of an anomaly, because the democratic liberal practices didn't align with the liberal democratic theory. In other words, theory said one thing, but what he was seeing in America was something different. So, but he said it was an anomaly. Later, Hochschild said, no, I'm not sure it's an anomaly. It's really kind of symbiotic. That is, because of slavery, liberal democracy and racism in the United States are actually mutually reinforcing. That one thing is helping the other. So that's why the racism just sort of seems normal. Around the notion of interest convergence, Derek Bell argued that whites would seek racial justice only to the extent that there was something in it for them. So sort of the classic case is the Brown versus Board of Education. For Black people, Brown versus Board of Education is about school desegregation, and that's the way we characterize it. It really is iconic. My dean at the School of Education, Diana Hess, interviewed all of the Supreme Court justices, I remember early in her tenure at Wisconsin as an assistant professor. She interviewed every Supreme Court justice, and she asked them if there's only so many cases that can be taught in a civics class in high school. What cases must be taught? There are only 2 cases that all of the justices agree on. Now, remember, this is at a time when Sandra Day O'Connor's on the court, Antonin Scalia's on this court, and there were 2 cases that all 9 justices agreed had to be taught. One is Marbury versus Madison. That makes sense. Judicial review, okay? But the second one is Brown. Now, the interest convergence in Brown is, on the one hand, you have Black people wanting access to better schools, but Brown, remember, comes in 1954 in the midst of the Cold War. And one of the things that was happening is that the Soviet propaganda was showing the United States as a place that was terrible to Black people, with the water cannons and the dogs. And so in many ways, the advantage for white America of Brown is to prove that they were an equitable nation. So for white America, Brown becomes a foreign policy move. That's where the interests converge. Race as a social construction. Here is Audrey Smedley, who's an anthropologist, who says there's a deep paradox between the scientific notion of no race, is what the geneticists tell us, there's no race, and the social parameters of race by which we conduct our lives and structures and our institutions. So on the one hand, there's no race, but on the other hand, we can see huge disparities that exist among the races. The question of intersectionality and anti-essentialism is the examination of race, sex, class, national origin, sexual orientation, and how their combinations play out in various settings. So as I said, none of us is just one thing. We're often a combination of a variety of things. So something happens to a Black woman. Is it happening because of her race? Is it happening because of her class? Maybe she's a working class person. Is it happening because of her gender? I always tell people, if I were back teaching US history again, I probably wouldn't start with the age of exploration. I'd probably start with the question and a picture of Fannie Lou Hamer and ask students, does democracy work for this woman? Why? Because she's a wonderful combination of race, class, and gender. And if it works for someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, then it works. People like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they didn't need democracy. They were wealthy. And I'm saying this to you as a native Philadelphian who has spent more time in Independence Hall and having taken students through there than I care to recall. But think about it. These were wealthy landowners. Everything worked in their favor. But would it work in the favor of a person like Fannie Lou Hamer? That's a fundamental question. And so it's these intersections, because even when the amendment was passed that allowed for Black men to get the franchise, it didn't include Black women. And then finally, there is this tenet of counter narrative. In other words, what's the story? And I love this African proverb that says, until lions have their historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter. So what's the other story? So that's kind of a basics of critical race theory. And let me just take a moment to ask how it applies to educational inequalities. So again, as I asked originally, how do you explain racial disparity? How do you explain academic disparities, particularly when they line up so perfectly along racial lines? So things like, how do you explain underrepresentation in advanced and honors classes? How do you explain overrepresentation in subjective special education placement? I'm not talking about special education placement where a youngster has a cognitive, or a physical disability. I'm talking about when it's the call of the teacher to decide whether or not somebody should go to special ed. We see it overrepresentation of particularly Black boys in these placements. How do you explain overrepresentation in suspension and expulsion? And why do all the differences seem to align with race? So that's the way in which I think about critical race theory. I'm not thinking about it as something to go into a K-12 classroom and teach. In fact, I'd ever taught it in teacher ed programs for undergraduates. Always taught at the graduate level as one of several theories to think about as our graduates begin to do their work. So, in summation, can I tell you that CRT is not sexy? Sometimes someone just likes to slap something on there. It's not trendy. Okay, oh, this is the greatest thing to do or to be against. It certainly is not new. It's not about racial navel gazing that, oh gosh, let me just look at what's happening with race. We've been discussing race for a very long time. I can actually make an argument for Frederick Douglass as a critical race theorist because his magnificent speech on what to the slave is the 4th of July is really a whole discussion of a counter narrative. And it is not taught in K-12 classrooms. So I hope that this kind of gives you a bit of an overview. I'm going to actually, for once in my life, be about a minute ahead of time. So we have an extra minute to ask any questions you'd like to ask.
Wonderful. Thank you. We will take your questions in the Q&A section. Feel free to type any questions that you have for Gloria Ladson-Billings in Q&A. I'd like to just start off with the question, critical race theory may not be sexy, trendy, or new, but what is new is that all these states all over the country are banning it. What's your explanation for that?
So I think it is a part of the playbook. I think critical race theory is less about its substance than it is about the 2022 midterm elections and the 2024 presidential election. Because if you're not winning on policy, then you got to gin up a culture war. You got to have something to come to people with. Are you going to win on what you proposed to do about COVID? I don't think so. I don't think you're going to win on even economic recovery when you have a president who has decided we're going to do all we can to push that money out there to make sure that, we try to keep people from being evicted and foreclosed upon and provide some child care relief. So you got to find something to win on. And so this becomes the flashpoint.
Yeah. The Wisconsin Assembly, not only passed what they said was a ban on teaching any concepts related to critical race theory in K through 12 schools. And as you mentioned, the critical race theory is not taught in K through 12 schools. But along with that, they're banning specific, words like diversity and inclusion and multiculturalism. What do you make of that?
Is that you and I talked as we prepped for the webinar, and there I said it really kind of reminds me of McCarthyism. That there's that we are banning. In a country that touts its freedom, we are banning the use of language. And we're not talking profanities here. Of course you don't want that happening, but we are saying our kids are not entitled to having any discussion about what they may indeed be experiencing. They can't ask questions about something that's fundamental to a free society. I am frightened by this decision to just squash any kind of debate, because debate is the core of a free society. If you want to be in societies in which you can't talk about things, then you're basically saying you don't want to be in a democratic society. But talking is what we do in a democracy.
Have several questions piling up here. Sally says this was an excellent presentation. Thank you. On this same line of thought, how do schools teach history in these divisive times?
I think that's exactly the challenge. You know, I'm not worried about attacks of critical race theory on people like me. I am an emeritus professor. There's not very much you can do to me. You can, what, not buy my book? Okay. But, you know, I have a lot of degrees of freedom. I'm worried about that teacher who is in Oconomowoc or who is in Rhinelander, who says, you know, my kids need to know more about the world, who gets told, no, you can't tell them this. I don't know what they can do other than stay strictly to a textbook. And I will tell you, as someone who has written social studies textbooks, those words are going to be in those textbooks. The publisher has to sell to the whole nation. And so it's not true in California. You don't want to alienate a California market. That's just too big a market. So it's going to be hard to find materials that don't bring up those particular terms. At best, I think the teachers will probably be in a position where they can't really go in depth and have good discussions about it.
Yeah. One of the Republican Assembly leaders in Wisconsin said that allowing teaching of concepts around critical race theory or systemic racism or white supremacy is racist in itself. What do you say to that?
I'll probably give them an analogy. And the analogy I would give is that if you say hostile work environment, if you say sexual harassment, if you say sexual abuse, it's sexist in itself. You know, it doesn't make any sense. You know, at one point, I think I said to someone, trying to have this debate with some of these people is like arguing with a toddler about what time to go to bed. You can't win it because they don't understand it's bedtime. So I think that the challenge is, again, we have not been able to get in front of this narrative. We didn't really see this one coming. And so now there is this whole attempt to play catch up on something we thought no one even cared about. And I will say that what I've actually looked at over time in terms of people showing up at school boards, and this is across the country, not just in Wisconsin, is that I'm willing to bet that most of those people don't even have kids in the schools, that they are not parents, but that they are operatives.
We have a question. What do you say to people who claim CRT is indeed being taught in K through 12 classrooms?
Give me an example. And I actually had that debate with John McWhorter, and he insisted that it was being taught. And I said, you know, I know you know a lot about linguistics, but now you're talking about schools and you're in my bailiwick. Tell me where it's being taught, because most teachers are under the gun for tests, reading and mathematics. They don't have time for much of this stuff. So he said, well, I don't want to go here, but so he shared a letter. He made the mistake of telling me what school the letter was from. It was from the Dalton School, which is a very high price private school in New York. And I explained to him, that's a school in which that person can vote with their pocketbook. They don't have to stay there. That's not what's happening in the majority of public schools. It's just not.
Looking at the representation in advanced honors classes, is the solution to eliminate advanced and honors classes at the high school level?
No, here's the solution, is to accelerate and to essentially say that all students, as a condition of graduation, need to take at least one honors course or one AP class or one dual enrollment where they are both in high school and taking a college course. Because it doesn't have to be AP biology or AP algebra. It could be, AP actually has a leadership course, or it could be an honors course in the arts. It can be a dual enrollment class that is actually at Madison College, and it is a leading towards a vocational. What we want is our youngsters to have exposure to the best that they can have exposure to. So no, I wouldn't eliminate them. What I would eliminate is remediation. Because remediation logically doesn't make sense. If you're saying a youngster is behind and the way you're going to get them to catch up is to slow them down, that's not going to happen.
Are there any groups you can recommend which are working against the censorship of language?
I work with a group called the African American Policy Forum, which is headed up by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is, as I pointed out in my remarks, one of the people who is a leader in critical race theory out of Columbia University. There's certainly the people who work at Teaching Tolerance as part of the Southern Poverty Law Center have been sort of on the battlefield, this work. Folks at Rethinking Schools in Milwaukee. People are working and have been working. This is just a new attack, but they've been working for a very long time.
Does forbidding CRT in schools actually mean that only white supremacy and history can be taught in K through 12 schools?
Well, I'll try to make the point that I made earlier. The one way to get a teenager to do something is to tell them they can't do it. I'm telling you, these kids are burning up Google, searching out critical race theory. I get so many emails from teenagers. Can you come and talk to us about this? And I'm like, no, I can't, but I can tell you what to read. I can tell you where to go look. They've made it forbidden fruit, which is only more intriguing,
One of our attendees says, I think this whole drive to ban discussion of CRT is about the fear of losing a position of white dominance. They are terrified and threatened. Do you agree?
I think it's a response to sort of changing demographics. Again, if you follow the pattern of American history, wherever we see some progress along racial lines, you often see a backlash. So in some ways, it is the response to the Obama era. It is the so-called populist, which I kind of resent, because I think that populism doesn't necessarily mean racism. I think it's much more a nativistic response. But I'm reminded by a colleague of mine from the University of Illinois, historian Jim Anderson, who tells us demographics are not destiny. If you think just because you have more people of a racial or ethnic group that they will, quote, take over, then you've paid no attention to South Africa. Because here is a nation that is 90% Black. It is still pretty much economically and politically dominated by white interests. Apartheid is gone, but people haven't moved out of their positions. I've been to South Africa 3 times in the post-apartheid era, and Black poverty is still more than anybody can imagine. Whites still own the most of the land. So it's never going to be about. Alabama was mostly Black. And at a time before the Voting Rights Act, all the voters were white. I mean, we literally have in one of the voter records before the Voting Rights Act, Blacks voting at a rate of less than 10%, and whites voting at a rate of, are you ready for this? 121%. I mean, you're voting a lot of times. So it's never just about the demographics. And it's interesting that people would feel that, oh, well, all of these people are coming here from these places and these populations are growing. And even the latest census report, one of the reports is, oh, for the first time, the white population is not growing. It's planting in people's minds this notion that everything is going to change because the numbers have changed, and that's just not going to happen.
Keith writes, if people can't access their hopes, they live by their fears, and that's the link between economic anxiety and racism. What do you say to that?
I think that's a very powerful statement, and it reflects things that we've seen throughout history. What happened in World War II is that Germany was in the midst of a horrible recession, actually depression. And so who becomes the scapegoat? The Jews? Seriously? That they're the reason that you're struggling to get a job? And so we always look for the scapegoats. We look, we'll have people say things. I lived in California before living here for a pretty long time, raised my kids there. And I would always hear people say, oh, these Mexicans are taking all our jobs. And I'm like, when did you want to be an egg washer? When did you want to be doing stoop labor picking strawberries? So I think there's always been that discourse that somehow these folks are taking our job, while at the same time not looking at corporate interests that really are taking your jobs. One of the first things I got a chance to do here in Wisconsin was do the Wisconsin Ideas Seminar. And I remember going out to Dodgeville to Land's End. And what did I see there were just tons of farm wives working in this factory, sending us those wonderful vests and mittens and what have you. But when I talk with those folks, they said, well, we mostly do this because we don't have health insurance. This is before Obamacare. We do this because this is the only way to ensure certain benefits. Or why do we place prisons in places like Portage, right? Because now you can provide a good paying state job to people who have been dispossessed. The folks are not mad at Kraft Foods for buying up the farms. They're gonna be mad at Mexicans or Black, Mexican immigrants or Black folks, but we didn't do it. And so it's I guess what they call in the common parlance, it's punching down. I can't punch up. I can't change the fact that Apple makes its products in China. But I can be mad at an Asian descent person about presuming that they're the reason for COVID,
Do you have any specific examples of codified or codified bans or limits placed on people of color in Wisconsin, of which I suspect there are many that we are unaware? If so, can we assume they've been eliminated?
Well, I'm going to be very provincial here because my whole life in Wisconsin has lived in Madison. And I describe Madison as a place where it has wonderful assets. Everything's here. I mean, it's like the best kept secret ever. We got everything from the symphony to good foods. I mean, you name it. It's asset rich. It is access, ACCESS, poor. If you don't know how to access this stuff, you're not getting it. And so if you look at my full bio, you will see that I sit on a lot of nonprofit boards. I'm the chair of the Urban League of Greater Madison Board of Directors. I'm on the United Way of Dane County. I was on Susan G. Coleman's board. I'm on the Madison Children's Museum board. And most of the reason that I join these boards is because I see that Black people are not accessing them. It's we have this fabulous children's museum. but getting there is not easy. Just parking in the center of this town, in the center of the isthmus, is difficult. The cost of a membership to the Children's Museum. So those sort of barriers that exist continue to leave certain groups out of touch. The degree of homelessness and hunger in a community this rich is very disturbing. And now we are seeing that the housing prices, when I first moved here, boy, housing was smooth. I was so happy to leave California and move to Wisconsin. But I can't say that anymore because the rents are just through the roof. And so it's harder and harder for people who work minimum wage jobs to live really decent lives. I think one of the things that the pandemic revealed for us, those of us who work with schools, is that schools are doing a lot more than teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. We were feeding a lot of kids, feeding a lot of families. So while they're not overt things happening, I think that the underlying narrative is that there's two Wisconsin. And if you know anything about the National Assessment of Educational Progress, Wisconsin has the greatest disparity between Black and white learners of any state in the nation. I did a workshop for the Black Women's Wellness Foundation. When I was doing the research for that workshop, here's what I discovered. I can gain 7 more years of life statistically by moving across the border to Minnesota. What is happening here in this state? I think those are hard questions that we have to ask ourselves.
Yeah. I wish we could answer that now. I mean, Wisconsin also has that, not only the educational disparities that are tops in the nation, if you want to say tops, but I mean, disparities all over the place, including the incarceration of Black men. And I think a lot of people wonder why Wisconsin is number one in such a shameful statistics. Let's see, we have, when I see people who are opposed to CRT interviewed on TV, they appear to be uneducated and older. Let's put it that way. What is the hope we can expect with younger, more informed citizens?
Well, I have great hope in young people. It's one of the reasons why I stayed in higher education for as long as I did. Because, I used to tell people there's only one thing I don't like about this job, and that is every year I'm a year older. And every year these people are 18. But I really did like the fact that they were 18. That they are more hopeful, that they're willing to try things, that they're not closed off to ideas. So that's sort of where my hope lies. And the demographic is changing. So my generation, which was, the baby boomers, and we took up a lot of space, is finally starting to shrink. That's not a good thing from the standpoint of our, we're facing our mortality, but we're finally becoming a younger nation. And I think that's such a important signal of hope for us. So yes, I do think that bodes well for us.
We are asked constantly to identify our race and ethnicity in many questionnaires. It seems that those questions could be changed to not continue using these categories as primary identity. Is there any talk of changing these categories of questions to something else?
I don't know, but it is a dilemma. It's one of the dilemmas that sociologists work with, and that is one of the ways you can understand patterns in a society is to collect that data. The University of California had something called Proposition 209. The state of California pushed through something called Proposition 209 that prohibited the use of race in any kind of state institutions. So that meant that the university system couldn't ask the number of Black students attending UCLA plummeted. In that first freshman class after 209, there were 40 Black freshmen. Now, UCLA is one of the most popular campuses in the country. They get so many more applicants. Everybody wants to go to UCLA. And I'm a UCLA grandparent. My oldest granddaughter went to school there. Not being able to identify race as a contributing factor meant that those numbers kind of disappeared. Now, Stanford, where I went to school, is a private school. So they could continue to use it. Stanford has one of the largest proportions of Black students in the country. Another school that has a very large proportion of Black students is Harvard. So here are what we know to be among the best schools who are using race as, according to their admissions deans, as a value added phenomenon. I spoke with the admissions dean at Stanford. He said, listen, we can only admit 1,700 students. It's a small campus, you wouldn't believe it. Well, it's not a small physical campus, but it's a small population. They have 12,000 students, 6,000 of which are graduates. So we're only talking about 6,000 students. That's like the size of a freshman class at Wisconsin. So they only try to get 1,200 students. To do it, they offer admission to 1,700 with the notion that, you know, some of these other students are applied to Stanford, but they also applied to Harvard, or they applied to Vanderbilt or Columbia. They wanted to go to another Ivy. 3,500 of the applicants, 3,500 have straight A's. So you can't do it on grades. 3,500 are in the 90th percentile of the SAT. So you can't just do it on a standard score. What they decided is that we need to build a class. So we want good grades, yes, but we also want some special attributes that make this class interesting. We don't want a class of all men. We don't want a class that's only interested in tech. We don't want a class of just Californians. We're an international university. So here they build that class. So there've been some students who have come into their classes that may not have had the same academic profile. They had a young man by the name of Eldridge Woods. He wasn't a straight A student, but he could swing a golf club, as you call him, Tiger. They had another student by the name of Debbie Thomas, who was actually a high school student with my middle son in San Mateo High School. She had good grades. They weren't the greatest grades, but she was an Olympic skater and she was Black. So here's this notion of what's going to enrich the community. And so if you're thinking of diversity as value added, as opposed to detracting, then you have a whole different approach to something like college admissions. You know, legacy, for example, is something that gets attacked in fits and starts, but not always. But, you know, in some of these schools, legacy is a big contributing factor. Just because your mother or your father was an alum, you're supposed to be able to come. And I will tell you, it's not just done at elite schools. It's the reason that question is on the application for the University of Wisconsin. Is there someone in your family who is a, that's not just a random question. Now, I get it from the fundraising side of the institution. You don't want to alienate alums. You want them to keep writing checks, but you're getting a bump up because somebody in your family went here. So those are the kinds of things that, you know, I don't know what other questions we could ask rather than to decide how do we want to build the class? What do we want the class to be able to do and contribute to the experience?
You have recommended reading for laymen, not education professionals.
If the reading is around critical race theory, I think Richard Delgado has a book called Critical Race Theory, a primer. But I would much rather have you read a couple of Derek Bell's books. First of all, Bell is an excellent writer, so it doesn't feel like you're reading law. All the law stuff is in the footnotes, and you don't have to read the footnotes, right? But you could read And We Are Not Saved, which just captivated me with his stories, because it's very fanciful. He's actually created an alter ego by the name of Geneva Crenshaw. And so she's constantly coming to him, asking him questions and telling these chronicles and stories. So, And We Are Not Saved, or Faces at the Bottom of the Well, which is probably one of his most popular books, is again, easy to read. It's a trade book. You don't have to worry about all knowing the legal precedents to be able to make sense of it.
Lots of positive feedback for you, and I will add to it. Your historical approach to explaining CRT is and was excellent. Thank you. Really excellent. So grateful for your clarity and certainty. Thank you. Maybe you can leave us with a takeaway. People who are listening to you now, or just watching this debate over teaching or not teaching anything related to critical race theory in the schools. What should our takeaway be? Is there anything we can do to change this course?
Well, it's probably what I've always said to my students as their US history teacher or their American government teacher, and that is, do not neglect your citizen responsibilities. And your citizen responsibilities are not merely voting and obeying laws. They are staying informed. They are entering the public arena, having the conversations, having the debates, being able to meet with people who may not share your opinion, but are reasonable. I always tell people I'd much rather have a conversation with a thoughtful conservative than a knee-jerk liberal. I just really want to hear the ideas. Someone has popped up and said, serve on a jury. Yes, those are all kinds of things that we want to stay engaged in. We, don't retreat from the public square. And I think that's something that has happened to us over the last decade or so. We all have decided that it's about our own private interests, and it really isn't. The public good is bigger than your private interests. We don't all get what we want. In the public good, it's not just the accumulation of private interests. Sometimes it's giving up a little something. I always tell people, in my ideal world, I want my trash collected on Monday because I make a mess on the weekend and I want it out. But that's not in the public interest. The way in which the sanitation department operates, my trash gets collected today, on Tuesday. So I got to live with that trash for one additional day. But it's better for the entire community. So I'm just hopeful that, what makes us a democracy will be brought to mind, that we will continue, as I said, to engage, to be a part of the public square and not retreat to these little private enclaves or to just special interests. Even the debate right now about vaccines, it's not about your body. It's about the public health, which is bigger than you. And so unless you actually have scientific data, don't tell me about, I'm not going to do this because it's my body. No, it's all of our bodies. So stay engaged is really my takeaway.
That's a good place for us to leave it. Gloria Ladson-Billings, thank you so very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Gloria Ladson-Billings is a professor emerita at UW-Madison, and she is the author of Critical Race Theory in Education. Thanks to all of you for your participation in this webinar. Our next webinar will be on December 10th at 2:30 p.m. This is a Friday, so a little different because our topic is a little different. We will be hearing from the author of several books, including Wisconsin Cocktails, Jeanette Hurt. And she will give us the history and culture of Wisconsin's iconic cocktails. So hope you can join us for that lecture coming up on December 10th. Registration information will be on the platomadison.org website very soon. This was just set up. Thanks to everyone for attending, and hope to see you next time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.